Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 21 of The Pick List. How has your week been?
It's been really good, thank you. I'm finally off deadline, so that's always very, very exciting. I'm right into another project. I'm just finalising another video training course on opinion writing, so that's very exciting. But I'm also very relieved to have got the massive writing deadline behind me as well. How have you been?
Yeah, good, thank you. You can reduce your caffeine intake now, which is good.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Just a touch. Yeah, great week, thank you. And this afternoon, which has been the highlight of my week, and I'm not exaggerating, I've been out on a pig farm, and it's been my second meeting outside my house for 7 months now, and it was just so nice to get outside and chat about business and chat about various things, from everything from African swine fever through to impact of Brexit. So with a fantastic pig farmer. So yeah, a real treat. And I should also point out, because it's episode 21, we're halfway through season 2 of the Pick List, and I don't know quite how that's happened.
No, I couldn't quite believe that. It takes us back to the discussion we had last week with Sophie about planning for Christmas soon. It adds to my pre-Christmas anxiety, because if we're halfway through season 2 already, Christmas must be around the corner. It's terrifying.
It really is. Just to make you panic, I've even started my Christmas shopping, and I'm always last minute. So,
I do not want to hear about that, Laura.
And we've got some amazing guests booked right up until the beginning of December already, which is great. But the treat that we've got today, and hopefully a treat for our listeners, is just me and you.
Yes, it's been a while since we've had a solo episode, haven't we?
It has, and it's great because I can just chat at you even more, so you're going to have to tell me when to shut up. So we've got 3 articles each this week.
Absolutely. Well, I'm still in charge of editing, so, if things get totally out of hand, we can fix it in post.
It's always my highlight of the week to listen to what you've chopped out, the jokes that haven't made it. Tell me what your first pick is this week.
So my first pick this week is from The Spoon. And it's an article titled "Labgrown Meat is Scaling Like the Internet." It's an opinion piece really by Ron Shigeta, and it originally appeared on Medium. It's basically looking at the hype around lab-grown meat and asking what I thought was a really interesting and important question. Is it really just hype, or is there a serious growth story here? Now, the author of this piece is an investor in Memphis Meats, which makes lab-grown meat, which of course gives you a sense of where he's coming from this. This is clearly someone, spoiler alert, who thinks this is a serious growth story and not just hype. But why he thinks that is quite interesting. And what he does in this piece is he sort of sets the scene by saying there's been obviously a lot of coverage around lab-grown meat. We hear a lot about its potential to totally disrupt and redefine the meat market. But at the same time, it also still feels like a technology that's quite far away. Whereas plant-based is something that, is happening right now, right here, with products that are on shelves today. Lab-grown, I think, in many ways still feels like science fiction and something that sort of gets a lot of attention but doesn't really feel like it's got much commercial application or viability at this stage. But, and this is the core of the argument here, the author believes there is actually a compelling case for saying this is much, much closer than it feels right now. The cost for lab-grown meat is falling faster than was the case for other major technology breakthroughs. And in 2021, the cost per serving of lab-grown meat is expected to drop to under $50. Now, that is still very expensive, of course, but that's not the point. The point is that it used to be way more than that only a few years ago. And he points out we've seen sort of a similar dynamic play out in plant-based as well. When Impossible first launched, the article says, the patties cost them about $100 a pop in restaurants, and now you can buy a pack for $10 at retail. There are, of course, still lots of challenges to overcome as well for lab-grown meat. He talks about the sector's reliance on fetal bovine serum, for example. And of course, it's also true that not all the startups that are making lots of headlines today, getting lots of noise and lots of hype, will necessarily scale up to be viable businesses in the long term. So yes, there is a degree of hype, but the piece concludes, make no mistake, animal-free, lab-grown, cultured meat is coming sooner than you think, which I thought was just such an interesting perspective. And I thought it was interesting in particular to hear it from an investor point of view, someone who's not just writing about this as an observer, but someone who clearly has put some money in his particular view of the market as well. I mean, as someone who obviously you've got such a long background in the meat industry, what do you think when you read an article like that? Do you buy into his argument about how close this is?
I know when you sent me what articles you were covering on today's show, I thought she's picked this one for me. So yeah, I always think it's been in the middle distance lab grown meat, and as you're right, as the article says, it's maybe closer than we think, but it's always felt, don't worry, it's cost prohibitive, it's a long way away. But I guess it does say it's coming closer, and we just need to look at the tech that we use every single day, how much cheaper that is than when it was originally invented. The 3 words in that article, though, I guess is still the bit that's going to be really interesting of how consumers latch onto this, is the fetal bovine serum, as you've alluded to. And so will vegans or vegetarians be interested in this product because of that? We don't quite know. And then will meat eaters be keen because will it have better sustainability criteria? And then what will the differentiation look like in retail in particular between a plant-based product, lab-grown product, and non-lab grown product, and I don't know quite what we're calling that, real meat. So what fixture space is that going to take up? Is it going to cannibalise some of the meat-free products or cannibalise the real meat? So, and I know I always feel like I'm a bit of a broken record on the show, but it's about what the consumer messaging is and how much they buy into it, particularly as that price continues to drop. What do you reckon? Do you think there's a clear road through, and will it be on that, because I think that's where the potential is, on that sustainability point?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think it's a really exciting sector, and in many ways I think it's more exciting than plant-based, and I have a lot of interest in plant-based. I think it's a really exciting sector. I'm not someone who follows a plant-based diet herself, but if you write about grocery and you write about food, there is a lot to enjoy in that sector in terms of fantastic stories, lots of interesting companies, lots of innovation, lots of experimentation and sort of trying and failing as well. So from a journalism point of view, and I think from a storytelling point of view, these are really interesting sectors to cover. What's so interesting about lab-grown, I think the technology story is exciting, but also I think it's the sense that you are not asking people to buy into a plant-based version of meat, but you are giving them meat. And so I actually think that from a sort of competition point of view, that it is a much bigger threat ultimately if it can scale, if the product delivers. Yes, I think sustainability plays a role in here as well, but I think it's ultimately about product delivery and about people understanding and feeling comfortable with the technology. I think it's a much clearer competitor product for meat and for dairy as well than some of these plant-based products. So I think it's a sector that needs to be taken really seriously, and I think is really exciting as well. How quick some of this comes to fruition, I mean, I have no sense. I find articles like these really interesting because they're sort of trying to kind of make an argument, or at least paint a picture about, when we're starting or when we're likely to see commercial viability. But, I think that all of that remains to be seen. But yeah, I think it's certainly not something that I would dismiss. I think it's got a lot of interest, a lot of investment, and I think it's really exciting. What's your first article for us?
Can we talk about Wales? That's my first article this week. So it's from the Retail Gazette, and it says the headlines: Grocers in Wales have discretion over ban on selling non-essential items. And it's been a busy week in the retail press, hasn't it? And this has been one of the lead articles. And to be fair, having retail across the major news outlets as well, not just our trade press. And this is all around the fact, as we know, that Wales are under a 17-day fire break to try and stop the spread of COVID. And there's been a restriction around what's deemed as non-essential products at retail, at the supermarkets, of clothes, bedding and kettles as examples. And this is all about trying to safeguard the retailers that are non-food retailers that sell some of these items, including books and other things, to make sure when this 17-day fire break's over, then they haven't been unfairly disadvantaged. So fashion, furniture shops have all been told to close, as well as leisure, hospitality and tourism outlets. So what this has done is, and it's created a huge media storm, and you can't miss some of the social media photos of that's particularly alcohol, and that there's been a lot of chat about how vodka is seen as an essential product. And other things aren't, and in particular Tesco have been dragged into this. There was an exchange on social media about some period products, and they were deemed to be non-essential in a social media exchange. And obviously they've said, no, sorry, we've read the rules incorrectly, they are essential. So it's now there's a petition forcing a rethink on this, and 60,000 people have signed. And Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, has said this meeting on Monday they're going to reconsider, but basically retailers have got discretion. And I read this and I have to admit I feel really sorry for retailers at the moment, particularly as we talk about regularly on this show, what a tough job it is to be on the front line of grocery retail at the moment, and they're having to decide at the checkout on occasions what is deemed as essential and not essential, and one person's essential is very different from somebody else's. What's been your thoughts of this coverage over the last week, and I guess the challenge around this and safeguarding these stores that have had to close? And I'll stop rambling in a minute. The other thing that I think hasn't been covered enough is the fact that people will just pivot to online. If I'm Jeff Bezos looking at my Amazon figures for Wales over the next 17 days, you'd be thinking, I'm not going to battle about trying to get through to buy a frying pan in Asda. I'm just going to buy it on Amazon because that's not been stopped. Well, it just feels like a mess. What are your thoughts?
I mean, exactly that. I think it's an absolute mess. And as you say, yeah, of course, I think people who are comfortable buying online, are able to buy online, are going to be buying online. I suppose in many cases, it's about people who don't have that as an option. And what position are we putting them in? Are we potentially making it really awkward for people to buy products that they do need, that are essential to them? I think the period product stuff was sort of, I think, just a stupid mistake. I don't think that was necessarily representative of how these rules were being interpreted. I think someone made a mistake and it's been fixed, and it's obviously embarrassing to have made the mistake in the first place. I'm assuming whoever thought this wasn't essential was a man, but I wouldn't want to cast aspersions. But I think that the issue once again is that it's perfectly easy for politicians to say, oh, we give retailers discretion, but someone has to apply that discretion. And as you say, working in retail in this climate, in this situation, is stressful enough. You're just passing the buck on to store staff, and you are putting them in situations where they have to make decisions on the fly. It's really difficult, even if you have guidance. And I saw that they've issued some further guidance with a sort of list of items that would be deemed essential. But still, you're sort of navigating 17 items or however, however long that list is. That's really difficult. People are going to make mistakes inevitably. They're going to get in trouble. They're going to have someone, shout at them in store or on social media. It just feels deeply unfair when there should be, clearer rules to begin with. I think doing something like a circuit breaker or a fire break is difficult and it's tough, but there are ways for politicians to make that a little bit easier on business, and I think part of that is setting really clear rules and not expecting store staff to referee those rules on the fly. But also, if you're so worried about other retailers and other businesses being disadvantaged by supermarkets selling these items, there are mechanisms for you to supply, to give support to those businesses. It's not just about stopping someone from buying some clothing in a Tesco store. If you're worried about other clothing retailers or whoever else is in your high street, I think there are other, better, more targeted mechanisms than having people rope off the clothing section in a supermarket. It was a nightmare.
No. And the other thing that I thought is we've seen so much on social media, for example, the greeting card section being cellophaned off and you can't buy a birthday card. If I was the likes of Moonpig or Funky Pigeon or one of these online players in that space, I'd be piling a huge amount of cash into my SEO for Wales at this point in time to think this is our opportunity. And as you say, there's some people that don't or can't buy online, but for those that have maybe been at that tipping point and thought it's always been easy to pick up at the supermarket, then they'll be setting up accounts maybe for some of these players, and ultimately the supermarkets will lose out in the long term as well. So yeah, conclusion being it's a bit of a mess. What's your second story this week?
My second pick this week is from the New York Times, and it's an article titled "Are Kidfluences Making Our Kids Fat?" The Kidfluences in this particular context are kids with incredibly successful YouTube channels where they review and play games and toys and things like that. It's a really, really popular genre. Lots of kids enjoy watching those videos. But there's a new report that suggests that these YouTube stars also end up promoting lots of unhealthy food and drink at the same time. The researchers behind this report found loads of instances where videos that were supposed to be about a game or a new toy also heavily featured junk food or junk drink. In some cases, the products featured so heavily that the videos were in essence thinly veiled ads, the researchers said, but in others it was a bit more of a grey area where the content, wasn't perhaps about the food and drink, but it still featured heavily in the video, so it still got screen time. Now, the difficulty here is it's just such a new to an extent still area and a really unregulated area as well. YouTube says it's really clear about not allowing any paid promotional content on YouTube Kids, which is the platform they have specifically designed to be safe for children. And they say they also have really clear guidelines for advertisers that restrict certain content, including certain food and drink content. But the researchers of this report argue that whatever the guidelines are, essentially there's still lots of promoting happening, or at least that there's lots of screen time being given to products that wouldn't get that kind of screen time on other platforms, particularly on TV. And what they did for this particular report is they basically identified 5 of the top kid influencers on YouTube, analysed 418 of their most popular videos, and they found that food or drink were featured in those videos 271 times, and 90% of them, they say, were unhealthy branded items. And one of the researchers is quoted in this article, and she says, "The way these branded products are integrated in everyday life in these videos is pretty creative and unbelievable. It's a stealthy and powerful way of getting these unhealthy products in front of kids' eyeballs." The big point of contention here is that, as I alluded to, we do, of course, have really strict rules on TV. But the lines aren't always as clear on some of these newer platforms. The regulatory framework hasn't always caught up. And even where guidelines exist, they're perhaps not always enforced consistently. There's also such a huge challenge, I think, for brands, because reaching younger audiences and reaching the next generation, of course, is also understandably a priority for them. How do you do that ethically? How do you do that responsibly when the media landscape is fragmenting? The idea that you can just run really big sort of family TV campaigns, well, that is not viable in many cases anymore. You have to figure out as a brand, I think, how you show up on some of these newer platforms. But yeah, as I said, how do you do that? How do you do that responsibly, in a way that regulators are ultimately going to be comfortable with, in a way that parents are going to be comfortable with, and in a way that doesn't end up being damaging to your brand reputation as well? What did you think of Kidfluences? I had never even heard of that term, but of course there's an influencer for everything and everyone, so of course there are Kidfluencers
No,
as well.
I felt like an old biddy. I hadn't heard of that term either, and I love the article, and some of the article's well worth looking at because some of the graphics in the article as well are really impactful and unsurprisingly super bright, which would appeal to definitely a younger audience. I think it's really tough because you think about what's happened over the last 8 months in particular, and a lot of my mates with kids have had to use tech more and more to keep their children occupied when they've been working from home and childcare has not been an option. So I think that there'll be more and more of these channels growing, but I think the pressure will grow on, as the article alludes to, on YouTube to regulate it more. And as you say, catch up.
I think it's about brands showing some leadership as well, and I think there are brands that understand that they have enormous power with their advertising dollars and the way they and pounds and the way they spend that, and there are many brands that have taken a public stand on the kinds of social networks that they're willing to spend their money on, and that have put pressure on these platforms. I think this is yet another area where I think the good brands are going to show real leadership and say, just because this is an unregulated platform or a reasonably unregulated area, we know that's what happens. You have new platforms gaining traction super, super quickly. There's not ever really going to be a scenario where the regulatory framework is going to be anticipating that. It's always playing catch up. That's the nature of regulation. I think it's about, brands showing where their ethics are and, being incredibly mindful about how they show up on these platforms. And I don't think the answer is that they don't show up at all, because I think that's totally unworkable. And I think it's understandable to say, look, if we have this fragmenting media landscape, as a brand, you're going to be looking at where you can capture that next generation of shoppers. Of course you are. But yeah, I think there are ways to do that ethically. And, if you are working with influencers really of any sort, pushing for really clear disclosure standards as well. I think this is something that is happening not just with this particular example, but I think across the entire influencer sphere. There's still so much content that isn't, I think, obvious enough. There's a paid relationship there, but if you're the one paying, I think it's within your gift to put some pressure on the people you're partnering with to say, we're expecting you to stick to the following standards of disclosure. So yeah, I think brands need to just show up and figure out what responsible behavior looks like in there, because I just don't think they're going to end up being bailed out by a regulatory framework that suddenly figures out how to anticipate all of these, changes in platforms. What's your next article?
My next article's from the Grocer, and it's Inside Asda's Sustainable Store Trial in Middleton. And Asda have now teamed up with brands to reduce plastic packaging, but how will it deliver on its greener at Asda price strapline? And it's an article by Ian Quinn. Really fascinating. The reason I picked this is because, as you know, I love a good nosy around retail. So I haven't been to the Middleton store yet, but I've been watching with interest some of the pics on social media over the last week of people that have been. So it's, again, how sad my life is. It's on my bucket list. So the article, maybe we could go on a day out. Never say never. once we're out of whatever tier we're in. So what the article does is, unsurprisingly, it sets out the journey and the launch of the store. And interestingly, it's been somewhat of a passion project by Roger Burnley, and he the CEO, and he originally planned this to launch in May. But it's only launched this month, which, to be honest, I don't think it's that bad considering COVID. So the fact it's only a few months behind, not bad at all. And the driver behind the whole launch of this store is some targets they set back in 2018, and that was a 15% cut in weight of plastic packaging by 2021. And it's also, Asda now have a new commitment added this week to remove 3 billion pieces of plastic from own brand products by 2025. What the store is, it's mainly loose product, and it's a conjunction of work with 20 brands, including Unilever, Kellogg's and Heinz, and they've had almost a year planning this store, and it's a single flagship, but the hope they're going to roll it out to more. And basically it allows you to refill reusable containers, and it has 15 huge banks of refill stations containing 30 household staples each. And it's been really interesting because this has been in the planning pre-COVID, and now it's been launched in COVID, how people feel about the fact that, you going around and touching dispensers and all of that sort of thing, and you're taking reusable packaging in, and which, other people could have touched the machines with their reusable packaging. And there's a really nice little quote in here from Roger saying, for many people during COVID, plastic reduction became a first world problem. And during the initial lockdown, he said, I was getting 2,000 emails a day and none of them were about plastic. So, and I know we've touched on this previously in the show about, how plastic did come very much back in vogue at the beginning of COVID. But he then goes on to say in the article, the environmental agenda for our customer is back with a vengeance despite the economic backdrop. And the article talks really nicely about how the trial is going to be, the success of it's going to be led by consumers and their feedback, and how closely consumers are going to be measured and tracked in terms of this trial store, and how actually this can be rolled out to other categories that don't lend themselves very well to refillable dispensers. So some of the things that are included, as I say, with some of the big FMCG brands, as pre-mentioned, but also there's game-changing recycling facilities, and I think this is really fascinating, particularly for cosmetic containers, toothpaste tubes, and all that sort of stuff that doesn't naturally recycle at home. And then the article goes on to say a year ago, a report by Greenpeace slammed supermarkets, including Asda. And it's been really interesting that Greenpeace, and I'm sure you've clocked it as well, is appearing a lot more in trade press about, the lobbying that they're doing behind the scenes, and also out in open public in their reports to try and push the dial for supermarkets to do things differently. What were your thoughts on the store, and are you excited to go with me as I am to go with you?
I mean, I would obviously go with you on a pick list day out where we have a look at the store. I think this is, I think this is pretty exciting. I mean, there are two things that stood out to me. I think it's really positive that this is now happening. As you say, there were loads of trials that were put on ice when COVID first hit for completely understandable reasons. And that great quote that you that you read out about, 2,000 emails, not one of them is about plastic. Of course, there were different priorities. I think retailers had different priorities, consumers had different priorities. But I think we do obviously need to think about what's next as well, and things like plastic, the need to reduce packaging, the need to reuse packaging. Well, none of that has gone away, even if it's been overshadowed for a while. So I think it's a positive signal to say we feel confident to now launch this trial, and we feel confident to push ahead with an initiative like that. So I took that as a really positive signal. I do like what they say about pushing the affordability angle on this as well. And I know Ian quotes, I think it's an unnamed supplier, and they're talking about some understandable supplier unease the minute you have a retailer saying, we want this new thing and we don't want consumers to be paying for it, as a supplier going, oh, guess who is going to be paying for it then? But I still think that I think that's an important signal, and is going to make some of these trials, I think, viable ultimately, that you are giving consumers a choice, and it feels like they're not being punished for making a more sustainable or more environmentally friendly choice. So again, I think that's interesting, and it reminded me of the commitment that Tesco made recently around increasing their plant-based range, where again they talked about that affordability angle. And it just feels like, obviously we are, it's a looming recession. The economy isn't looking too great. I think we're starting to see more retailers really talk about affordability in connection with some of these initiatives. So that stood out to me as well. Obviously, it'd be interesting to see what response is, whether this is something that can be scaled up at this stage. I thought it was also interesting to read Adam Leyland's, the Grocer editor's leader column on this. He, I think, rightly pointed out that it's fantastic to have these big brand names in there, but there are also some really innovative smaller brands that are doing fantastic work on sustainability and on more sustainable packaging. It'd be great to see major supermarkets really make a point of going to these suppliers and giving them a platform with some of these sort of trial concepts as well.
Yeah. What's your final pick this week?
So my final pick this week is from Glossy, and it's titled Twitch Emerges as Rising Platform for Beauty Brands. So we're returning to this idea of talking about emerging platforms I am not on, and as you said, make me feel like my own grandmother. But it's really fascinating to see just how many of these new platforms are out there, and also the different opportunities that exist for brands, beauty brands in this case, but I think this has applications for wider FMCG as well. The particular trend or the platform that we're focusing on here is the rise of Twitch. And Twitch is a streaming platform, a live streaming platform, where people primarily stream themselves playing videos and video games, and watch other people play video games and interact with them. But it's also increasingly used for other content, including beauty and lifestyle content. And it's hugely popular, and as a result is becoming a more interesting platform for brands. So brands are seeking opportunities to sponsor Twitch events, things like TwitchCon, but they're also striking partnerships with influencers and streamers. And what I thought was interesting here was the way they talked about what makes Twitch an appealing and effective platform from a branding point of view is that the audience is very, very engaged. The platform is built for engagement and for interaction. And it has a style and a tone, I suppose, that's a bit more relaxed than some other social media platforms. We hear a lot about the backlash against, I think in particular, Instagram's more staged influencer aesthetic, the idea that, you're filtering everything and it has to be perfect and you're sort of showcasing this sort of perfect version of your life. And platforms such as Twitch can be a little bit more laid back, and they can allow influencers to talk to their audiences about brands, about products they like, in a way that just perhaps feels a little bit more relaxed and a bit more authentic. So inevitably you kind of think, well, what are the opportunities here for grocery brands or FMCG brands? And it certainly feels like that whole gaming piece, not necessarily just on Twitch, but just esports gaming in general is an area that a lot of FMCG brands are now investing in quite heavily. And I think they're really waking up to the potential around gaming. So I'm sure we'll see them look at a platform like Twitch as well. But at the same time, you could really see that, there are opportunities there, perhaps also for some direct-to-consumer brands, those sorts of DTC brands that have already really embraced Instagram. They could also see this sort of informal, conversational, laid-back style that exists on Twitch. and see a real opportunity to partner with influencers, who can then bring some of these smaller brands to their audiences as well. Did the article make you feel as ancient as it did me? And could you see this as something that is going to be of relevance for FMCG brands increasingly?
Yes and yes. So I felt like a really old biddy, and I loved reading this article because I've been hearing more and more about Twitch, and I always just pigeonholed it that it's for gamers and it's very much niche for that. But as you say, that authenticity that it brings for brands and explaining cosmetics through to food products, that Instagram doesn't, and it's not staged and it's more natural, that consumers really like. And I suppose it really drives back to where's your audience and what they're doing, and the importance of really understanding that where your target market is, and that segmentation of where are they spending their time, and making sure you've got if you've got a young consumer, then making sure you've got a young marketing team as well that aren't taking traditional routes and not knowing there's millions and millions of people sat on Twitch every night. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in the article, and again this is an absolute must read, is that the comment that the author leaves Twitch running overnight. And it made me think of the movie Ready Player One, that you just you're embedded into that separate world, and it's part of your life, and that left it running in their bedroom. Just thought, wow, that this is the exposure that it gets to your life. It is huge. So I need to probably research a bit more about how it works without getting too sucked into it. But I think it just shows you again how pacey our world is, and that talking about for some Instagram and TikTok isn't relevant anymore.
What's your final article?
My final article this week is an article via Presswire, and this is the top 5 global trends that the food industry will experience in 2021. And this is fueled from a report generated by ADM, the global leader in nutrition. And I was really interested in what they were pitching as the top 5 things, and based on their report. So firstly, a more proactive approach to nourishing the body and the mind. And there's some comments around this that consumers are gravitating towards food and beverages with bright colours, that will incite citrus flavours and naturally occurring vitamin C. And I was really interested by this because, again, on one of our previous shows, we've spoken about how the orange market has just gone bananas, excuse the pun, in terms of a boost in sales and people crying out for more vitamin C products. So I was interested by that. Sustainability taking centre stage, no surprise there. And the report saying over 2/3 of people want to buy products that have a positive impact on the environment through their everyday actions. And I'm always interested in reports like this because they're saying that, but do they actually do it within the supermarket, and particularly dependent on how much cash they've got to spend. The third article really struck me, and it's around gut health and it emerging as a gateway to wellness. And I don't know about you, but I'm seeing more and more particularly about gut health and how gut health links to cognitive functions, and making sure that you're looking after yourself in that way, and how digestive issues are becoming more and more raised up the agenda, and how the food industry obviously has a huge role to play there. The fourth article, which we've already touched on today's show, is plant-based boom continues to expand. And it talks a little bit in the article about dairy alternative categories. And we know there's been a huge dairy alternatives for some time, but saying that's going to expand even more so into yogurts, ice cream, butter, spreads and creamers, obviously particularly in the US market, and how the dairy aisle is going to be standout for animal-free products. And then finally, and again, no surprise, but I think it's something that the food industry can continue to drive forward, transparency builds consumer trust. And this fact that consumers are going to want to know more and more where their food comes from. And it says, in fact, 26% of global customers look for the country of origin on food and drink labels, which when you think transparency, that number's not that high. When I know some organisations and countries would like that to be one of the number one drivers, and it's still a bit further down the list. How much of that 5 things would you agree with that you think is going to be a 2021 mover and shaker, and how much of it is a bit of PR puff?
Oh God, it's quite difficult to say. I mean, who wants to be predicting anything at the moment? I know we're in sort of food trends prediction season, but it feels like it's a little bit, well, we'll see how COVID plays out. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to be in the business of having to make predictions at the moment. It's a sort of, I thought it was an okay list. I think it's really difficult, when you're writing about these sort of food trends, or if you're in the business of putting together press releases, or reports coming up with these food trends, because in a way you are either going to end up vastly overplaying fairly niche trends in order to be able to say something new, or you're going to say things that are probably long-term multi-year trends that are more robust and more substantial trends, but also make you sound a little bit boring and like you're saying things that everyone already knows. I'd say this falls into the second category. I don't think there's anything I disagree with, but it's also one of those things where you're like, okay, fine. I mean, we've heard this. I think these are quite long-running themes, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with highlighting them, but gut health, no one's going to fall off their chair in amazement that gut health is a trend. Yes, it is, and it has been for some time, and I'm sure it's going to continue being an important trend into next year, especially because of that link with immunity as well. And of course, as you say, immunity is I'm sure is going to be a really, really important topic in 2021. Transparency, again, these are all perfectly good things to be focusing on, and I think they are undoubtedly important. Are we suddenly in 2021 going to have the year of transparency? I didn't see anything in that particular report or the press release that made me think that there was a step change here. I think it's just one of those ongoing trends that has been true for some time, and I'm sure is going to continue being true in 2021. So I thought it was a perfectly solid list of trends, but nothing that made me think this was really going to be different for 2021. But yeah, as I said, I think that's the nature of these forecasts to an extent. You're either overplaying the novelty or you're just saying things that everyone already knows, because food and buying behaviour doesn't change that dramatically year on year. But then how on earth are you going to write about your new trend? You need to kind of, pull out things that do feel a little bit new.
That's my highlight of chatting to you, because you always give me a brilliant PR lesson.
I'm not sure that is a brilliant PR lesson, because I would have said, I don't think I would have covered this, because it sounds like it's a lot of the same stuff, but that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it difficult to get coverage for, this is why when you look at I think Whole Foods Market does these trend predictions really, really brilliantly, and it's much easier for them to do that to an extent, because they have a brand that lends itself to the sort of really foodie, slightly niche trends. But I think they're also very good at giving the trends that they see good names. It's never just, we're going to see more about mushrooms. They're going to either pull out a super exciting, very specific mushroom, or they're going to come up with a really fun way that kind of encapsulates that trend. I think they are the people to look at for that. I think Waitrose actually does it really well as well. But Whole Foods Market, I think, always delivers on that.
Well, it's been a lovely chat, and it's different, just you and I, and we're back with a guest next week, aren't we?
We are indeed, yes. Lovely to chat to you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.